Spring 1945. The air smelled of smoke and antiseptic. In a makeshift Allied field hospital somewhere between the Elbe and the Rhine, a young German nurse named Marguerite stood frozen in the doorway, her white apron stained with blood that belonged to men she'd been trained to call enemies. The morning light filtered through canvas walls, casting amber shadows across rows of cots, where wounded soldiers lay in various states of consciousness. She held a metal tray in trembling hands, but it wasn't the surgical instruments that made her fingers shake. It was what an American medic had just placed on that tray. 2 thick slices of white bread, a tin of corned beef, real butter wrapped in waxed paper, and a Hershey's chocolate bar still in its brown wrapper. He'd smiled at her.
"This enemy soldier, and said she looked hungry."
She'd been taught that Americans were barbaric, that they would torture captured medical personnel, that their material wealth was built on the exploitation of inferior races. Yet here stood this boy from Pennsylvania, perhaps 20 years old, offering her food as casually as if they were neighbors, sharing a Sunday meal. The collapse of the Third Reich had created millions of such moments, small fractures in the facade of ideology where human beings encountered one another across the wreckage of certainty. Throughout 1944 and into the spring of 1945, as Allied forces pushed deeper into German territory, captured Wehrmacht personnel, including medical staff, found themselves thrust into a reality that contradicted everything Joseph Goebbels' propaganda ministry had promised them. The German nurses, many of them idealistic young women who had volunteered for the League of German Girls before being conscripted into military medical service, had spent years in a hermetically sealed information environment. They'd been told that American soldiers were criminals released from prisons to fight, that they would commit unspeakable atrocities, that the democratic nations were decadent and weak, their citizens soft from luxury, their armies held together only by Jewish puppet masters, and the promise of plunder. Margaret had believed these things because she had no reason not to. Born in 1924 in a small Bavarian village, she'd grown up in a Germany humiliated by Versailles, strung mad by economic depression, and then seemingly resurrected by National Socialist promises of restored greatness. By the time she was 14, she was attending Bund Deutscher MacDull meetings, learning that her highest calling was service to the Volk, that the Führer represented not just political leadership but spiritual renewal, that Germany's enemies envied and feared the pure racial consciousness the Reich embodied. When she'd trained as a military nurse at 19, her instructors had been clear. German medical proficiency was superior, precisely because it emerged from Aryan discipline and organization. The Americans and British, they said, relied on material abundance to compensate for their racial and moral inferiority. Their wounded would die in squalor. Their medical supplies would be crude and insufficient. Their soldiers would show no mercy to captured German personnel. None of it was true. The first shock came, not with violence, but with plenty. When Margaret's hospital unit was overrun by the American Third Army in late March 1945, she and 17 other nurses had huddled in a basement storage room, certain they were about to be executed or worse. They heard boots on the stairs, harsh English commands they couldn't fully understand, the sound of doors being kicked open. Then an American officer appeared, his uniform clean despite the circumstances, and through a German-speaking lieutenant, he told them they would be safe, that they would continue to care for wounded German soldiers under Allied supervision, that they would be provided with rations and medical supplies. The nurses had exchanged confused glances. This had to be a trick, some cruel prelude to the atrocities they'd been warned about. But the food arrived that evening. Real food, abundant and carelessly generous. C-ration tins, stamped with production, dates and nutritional information, the kind of bureaucratic thoroughness that revealed an economy so vast it could afford to print detailed ingredient lists on supplies meant for soldiers who might be dead tomorrow. White bread that was actually soft, not the sawdust extended loaves that had become standard in Germany by 1944. Canned meat didn't require a desperate imagination to identify. Powdered coffee, real cigarettes, chocolate bars, mass-produced in quantities that seemed obscene. The American soldiers distributed these things without ceremony, without the careful rationing and accounting that had governed every scrap of food in the Wehrmacht for years. They ate from their own rations and offered the rest as if abundance was so natural it required no comment. Marguerite remembered the chocolate bar with particular clarity for the rest of her life. She hadn't tasted real chocolate since before the war. In Germany by 1945, chocolate was a memory, replaced by ersatz confections made from beet pulp and synthetic flavoring that tasted like sweetened cardboard. The Hershey bar the American medic gave her was small, unremarkable to him, probably forgotten within an hour. It was evidence of something she couldn't yet process, that America had been fighting a global war on multiple continents while still producing luxury items for its common soldiers, that its industrial capacity was so vast that chocolate for troops was barely worth noticing, that everything she'd been told about the weakness and imminent collapse of the democratic nations was a lie so complete it made her question what else she'd been wrong about. The historical record bears witness to thousands of these encounters, documented in letters, memoirs, and military reports that emerged in the decades following the war. Captain James Henderson of the 45th Infantry Division wrote in his diary about the look of absolute disbelief on captured German medical personnel's faces when they saw the contents of an American field hospital. They kept touching things, he noted. The rubber gloves, the plasma containers, the stacks of bandages, as if they suspected it was all theatrical. Props for some elaborate deception. An after-action report from the 104th Infantry Division recorded that captured German nurses had to be convinced to actually eat the food provided to them because they assumed it was poisoned or that accepting it would result in some later punishment. Soviet propaganda had portrayed Americans as capitalist exploiters. Nazi propaganda had portrayed them as racial mongrels and cultural degenerates. Neither ideology had prepared anyone for the banal reality that American soldiers were, for the most part, ordinary young men from ordinary backgrounds, casually generous because they'd grown up in a society where generosity was affordable. The contrast between expectation and reality operated on multiple levels. German military medical doctrine emphasized efficiency and hierarchy. Resources were allocated according to strict calculations of military utility. Soldiers with wounds that would take too long to heal or that compromised their combat effectiveness were triaged accordingly. The American approach baffled German medical personnel because it seemed to waste resources on sentiment. American medics and doctors treated wounded prisoners with the same aggressive care they gave their own men, expending supplies and effort on soldiers who would never fight for the Allied cause, who might even return to combat against them if exchanges occurred. This wasn't stupidity or naivete. Though German observers initially interpreted it that way, it was something else, something embedded in American cultural assumptions about individual human worth that transcended military calculation. Nurs Elga, captured near Aachen in October 1944, later wrote about her 6 months in Allied custody with a tone of bemused recalibration. She described watching an American doctor, himself exhausted from operating for 14 straight hours, stop to joke with a wounded Wehrmacht private about baseball, a sport the German soldier couldn't begin to understand. The doctor spoke no German, Schneider recalled, and the private no English, but they communicated through gestures and laughter about this game that meant nothing to either of them in that moment, except that it was a refuge from war. I realized then that I had never seen a German military doctor speak to a common soldier except to give orders or render diagnosis. The American democracy that we had been taught to despise as weakness was actually a kind of strength we couldn't recognize because our entire framework was built on hierarchy and obedience. Food. That chocolate bar, those casual tins of meat and cigarettes, became in memory more than simple provisions. They became symbols of an ideological chasm that German personnel hadn't known existed until they stood on the other side of it. In the Reich's worldview, sacrifice and scarcity were virtues, proof of racial discipline and willingness to suffer for the Volk. Leaders ate better than common soldiers, officers better than enlisted men, Germans better than the subhuman categories their ideology created. This was considered natural and proper, the material expression of hierarchy that reflected cosmic racial order. American abundance disrupted this framework entirely. Here was an army where even the lowest private ate reasonably well, where supplies existed in such quantities that sharing with captured enemies occasioned no comment, where the industrial and agricultural capacity of the nation was so overwhelming that fighting a two-ocean war hadn't required the civilian population to starve. Between 1944 and 1945, as millions of German military and civilian personnel came under Allied control, these small revelations accumulated into a collective, cognitive crisis. Propaganda could explain battlefield defeats with tallies of overwhelming numbers and material advantage, could frame retreat as strategic, could promise wonder weapons and final victories that never came. But propaganda couldn't explain why American soldiers were kind when they had no reason to be, why they shared food when they could have lorded its scarcity over the defeated, why they treated captured personnel as human beings rather than ideological categories. The kindness, casual and unself-conscious, was more devastating to Nazi ideology than brutality would have been. Brutality would have confirmed what they'd been taught. Kindness revealed that what they'd been taught was comprehensively false. The documentary evidence suggests these encounters had lasting psychological impact. In interviews conducted in the 1970s and 1980s with former German military medical personnel, researchers found that many dated their disillusionment with National Socialism, not to dramatic moments of defeat, confrontation with atrocities, but to these quiet encounters with American generosity. One woman described accepting a cup of coffee from an American soldier and weeping, not from relief or gratitude, but from the sudden, destabilizing realization that she'd spent 6 years believing in a worldview that was simply wrong about nearly everything that mattered. Another recalled an African-American medic treating her infected hand with a gentleness that contradicted every racial theory she'd been taught, forcing her to confront the uncomfortable question of how many other lies she'd accepted without examination. The symbolism of food operated on both practical and metaphoric levels. Practically, the abundance of Allied provisions demonstrated industrial and logistical capabilities that made continued German resistance objectively futile. The Wehrmacht by late 1944 was running on fumes, its supply lines shattered, its soldiers subsisting on increasingly inadequate rations, its medical supplies so depleted that wounded men often died from treatable infections. The Americans and British, meanwhile, were eating well enough to share, supplied by a logistics network that stretched across oceans with clockwork reliability. Metaphorically, the act of sharing food without hatred represented something deeper. The possibility of human fellowship that transcended national and ideological division. A democratic impulse toward equality that didn't require a shared belief or shared identity, only recognition of common humanity. Marguerite kept that Hershey's wrapper in her pocket through the remainder of the war and 4 years afterward. A small rectangle of brown paper embossed with English words she eventually learned to read. It reminded her of the moment her certainty cracked, when a teenage soldier from Pennsylvania offered her chocolate as if she were his sister rather than his enemy. She'd expected punishment or contempt. She received instead a casual assumption of her human worth, that her own ideology had never extended to those it defined as outside the Volk. That wrapper survived. Long after the chocolate was gone, a tangible fragment of the day the world revealed itself to be different than everything she'd been promised. The transformation these encounters produced wasn't instantaneous or universal. Many German prisoners of war and captured personnel clung to Nazi ideology, despite evidence, interpreting American kindness as weakness or maintaining that Germany's cause had been righteous, even in defeat. But for significant numbers of medical personnel, particularly women who had less investment in martial mythology and more direct exposure to the human costs of war, these encounters became inflection points. They marked the beginning of a long, painful process of ideological deconversion, of reconstructing understanding from the ground up when every foundation had been revealed as sand. In the vast literature of World War II, these moments rarely appear. They lack the dramatic intensity of major battles or the moral clarity of concentration camp liberation. They're too small, too intimate, too ambiguous in their emotional register. Yet they represent something essential about the nature of ideological conflict and its resolution. Wars are won with firepower and logistics, but ideologies die in quieter moments, in the gap between what people were told to expect and what they actually experience. In the simple human gesture that reveals the enemy to be something other than the monster propaganda requires. The American soldier who gave Marguerite that chocolate bar probably never thought about the interaction again. He moved on to the next crisis, the next patient, the next battle. and eventually home to Pennsylvania, where he would spend the rest of his life doing whatever people do. When they survived wars and returned to ordinary time, he didn't know that his casual generosity, meaningless to him, would reverberate through someone else's consciousness for decades, that it would become the hinge on which a worldview turned. That's the strange arithmetic of kindness in wartime. Its significance often registers nowhere except in the recipient's memory, invisible to history until someone asks and someone answers, and the small moments accumulate into a pattern that explains something larger, about how certainty collapses and how people reconstruct meaning from its wreckage. By the time German nurses and other medical personnel were in the months following Germany's surrender, they carried with them not just memories of defeat, but evidence of a different way of organizing human society. They'd seen that abundance need not produce decadence, that democracy need not mean chaos, that racial hierarchy was neither natural nor necessary, that human beings could extend dignity across the lines that ideology insisted were absolute. Not all of them absorbed these lessons. Some returned to shattered communities and helped rebuild them along old patterns of thinking, maintaining that Germany had been betrayed rather than wrong, that the suffering was unjust rather than consequence. But others carried forward a different knowledge, born in those moments when an enemy offered food without hatred and revealed through that simple act the possibility of a world organized around different principles. 70 years later, in reunified Germany, researchers interviewing the last surviving witnesses to these encounters found that many still remembered with exact clarity the first meal an American soldier shared with them, the first casual kindness, the moment the propaganda collapsed under the weight of lived experience. An elderly woman, once a young nurse from Bavaria, recalled the taste of that long-ago Hershey's chocolate, the sweetness that was just sweetness, without ideology or hatred, and how it taught her something that 6 years of propaganda could not obscure, that the world was not what she'd been told, that her enemies were not what she'd believed, and that perhaps there was a kind of strength in the generosity she'd been trained to dismiss as weakness. In the end, it wasn't the grand speeches or the dramatic battles that changed minds. It was the chocolate bar, the shared cigarette, the cup of coffee offered without comment or condition. It was the daily, unremarkable abundance of a democratic society that could fight a global war and still produce enough to share with those it had defeated. It was the recognition, slow and painful and irrevocable, that everything she'd been promised about the superiority of her own system was contradicted by the simple fact that the Americans had enough food to give away, enough confidence in their own values to treat enemies as human beings, enough strength to be kind. The Reich had promised glory and delivered ash. America promised nothing but demonstrated through 10,000 small gestures what it meant to value human dignity without requiring ideological conformity or racial purity. That lesson, learned in field hospitals and prison camps across Europe in those final months of the war, outlasted all the propaganda, all the certainty, all the grand theories about racial destiny and historical necessity. What remained was the memory of chocolate offered by an enemy who refused to hate, and the slow understanding that some kinds of abundance cannot be seized or commanded, only built through decades of ordinary people extending ordinary decency to one another, even and especially when ideology insists they should do otherwise.